Hi, I'm Marius from Imways Photography, and welcome back to another episode of Digital Photography Today, the show where you will learn how to become the master of your camera. Now, in the previous episode, part 1 of Off-Camera Flash, we talked about the gear, what you will need, your triggers, your flashes, we talked about all that. So now in today's episode, Lumen wants to learn all about your settings, and she wants to learn about sync speeds. So to help us today, our model will be Raphael here, the Ninja Turtle, which this is why Lumen is on my lap, because she wants to get to Raphael. So this is also a nice little pillow, so if Lumen wants to sleep, she can put her head there. Okay, so we're going to use little Raphael here to be our model for the day. And we're going to practice on Raphael to show you what your sync speed is. Because if you don't know what your sync speed is, you're going to have problems where you've got these bars on your pictures. I'm going to show you why that happens, so you don't get them in your pictures. Then we're going to talk about your exposure, because very important with off-camera flash, or with normal flash photography as well, but especially with off-camera flash, when your camera and your flash is not really chatting to each other, and you're working full manual, your flashes are all around the place, and you want to set the power levels on them, but you don't only have flashes in your shot, you've got ambient light as well. So a flash image actually consists out of 2 light sources. It's ambient light and flash. Now the moment you balance those 2 properly, you've got a good image. If your flash is maybe too bright, it looks washed out. If your background is too dark, it looks overly flashlit. Unless there's a specific reason you are taking a shot like that, for maybe the lighting you want to achieve in a shot, then I can understand. But if all your shots are pitch black dark in the background and it's forced flash from the front, or it just looks harsh, then you're doing something wrong. So I want to show you how you set your exposure, and you're going to have to do that in manual mode. The reason manual, in normal program aperture and priority and shutter priority, your camera does the following. It looks at the ambient light, and it tries to just get the ambient light right. But sometimes you want to have the ambient light maybe a little bit darker, maybe a little bit brighter than what the camera thinks it should be. So your camera is not necessarily going to work, especially for your off-camera flash, it's not necessarily going to know what you want to do. So the moment you work in manual, you can set the amount of ambient light you want, you can set the amount of flash power you like. So then it becomes really exciting and you can do some amazing stuff. So the first we're going to look at now is your sync speed. What is it? I'm going to show you what it looks like when you go over it, so you don't make that mistake. So let's first look at sync speeds. When we start to talk about sync speeds, you'll notice different cameras have got different sync speeds. Some of them might sync at 160th, another one 200th, and another one maybe 250th of a second. And then you'll also notice your triggering units, like for instance the cactus and that flash cue, your pocket wizards and all those, they've got different sync speeds as well. So depending on what you own or what gear you're using, you will have different sync speeds. Okay, so what the hell is a sync speed? Now this is the Nikon D7000. I'm going to turn info on here, and you can see that I'm using manual 200th of a second at f11. Now 200th is my sync speed. Now if I take this picture of Raphael, I've got on top of the camera, if I press this button, you should see a little bit of a flash happening there in the background. That's the flash, the Nikon SP910. I'm shooting from the side to light Raphael. If I take the picture, I press preview here, you can see Raphael is lit from the side because the flash is to the left of Raphael. Now you'll notice from the top to the bottom, the entire image, you can see there's an image. From the table at the top to right there at the table at the bottom to the curtain at the top, you can see there's light all over the frame. Now the moment I start to increase the shutter speed, for instance here now is 320th of a second, if I take the shot again, press preview, you'll see a little bit of the table is gone. There's now a black bar right there at the bottom. And then if I go back to info, let's make it say 400th of a second, shoot again, you'll see now there's a black bar almost all the way to below Raphael's chin. Now the more I increase my shutter speed, the bigger this bar will become. So here's 500ths of a second. You'll notice now it's just above Raphael's head, and the faster I go with the shutter speed, the more will be covered. Okay, so why the hell is this happening to my picture? Okay, so this is where your sync speed comes in. Now I'm going to set the sync speed back to 200 and I'll explain why this happens. Now I can use 200th of a second or anything slower than this. Now inside your camera you've got your sensor. Now you know your sensor records all the light coming into the camera. That's where the tricky part is. We've got two light sources here, like I've already said a few times in this off-camera, or the off-camera videos I've posted in the last few episodes. You've got two light sources. So I've got flash, which just gives one burst of light, and then I've got the ambient light. Now the ambient light in this room is the light coming through the side curtains here, as well as the video light, which I've got turned on. Now the light inside this room doesn't change. It's really constant, and it's just on. So I can have a shutter speed that's very fast or a shutter speed that's very slow. It really doesn't matter. If I control my aperture, I can basically change how long I want the camera to record light in this room, because the light is on the entire time. Now, because your flash just gives a burst of light, that is why we get this big problem. So anything below sync speed, your entire sensor is exposed to all the light coming into the camera. So all the ambient light and all the flashlight, just that quick burst of flashlight, everything that goes through the lens into the camera is being recorded on my sensor. The moment I go above sync speed, that's where the problem comes in. Now, for instance, if you look at this picture again, you'll notice that sync speed, if I go back, the faster I went, the further that block increased, the faster my shutter speed went. So if I, for instance, shoot at like 2,000th of a second, you'll basically see nothing in this room. It's just going to be a big black frame. And it's not because of the aperture or the flash or anything, it's because of that sync speed. Now, the moment you go over 200th, you'll find that your shutter can't allow the entire sensor to be open anymore. The shutter blades inside the camera, so for instance, if you shoot at like 2,000th of a second, the distance between the blades are so tiny, it's something like this. So it basically just runs over the sensor and it records the image. Now that's fine when you're using ambient light, which are turned on the entire time. The moment you've got flash power, what happens is, especially if your entire image is flash lit, like for instance this image of Raphael here, if I go back to the one you can see the entire frame, this entire image is flash lit. So if I take this unit, the triggering unit, off the camera, I'll show you now when we get to the next part of the settings. If I take the unit off the camera, it'll actually just be a pitch black flame, not a flame, a frame, because the ambient light in this room is not enough to shoot at 200th of a second at f11. So that means the entire image is actually flash lit. So the moment my shutter speed goes over sync speed, those shutter blades are basically covering the sensor. So the light from the flash can't come through. Now when you're using on-camera flash or use Pocket Wizards, you can use what's called high-speed sync. On Nikon it's called Auto FP, and that allows me, when I've got my Nikon SP910 on top of the camera, that I can sync at any shutter speed. But there are some drawbacks. You need to know about your range. Your flash isn't as strong anymore, but you can use it at basically over sync speed, but you need to know what you're doing. So if off-camera flash and all these entry-level triggering units, just know the moment you go over your sync speed, this is what's going to happen. You will then get these bars over the image. So once this happens, just know that's the reason, because you are going over your sync speed. So just make sure you are shooting below it and you will be perfectly fine. So next, let's look at the camera settings. Now with the settings, like I've said a few times already, it's really important that you use manual exposure. Now the reason for that is, if I press the info here, you can see that I've got my shutter and my aperture. Now with this front dial right here, I can control my shutter speed. So I can go faster and I can go slower. And you can see at this line here in the bottom, you can see that with the exposure, I'm completely underexposed. That's why I said, when I turn the flash off, this room is basically pitch black dark when I take the shot. There's not enough light in this room to take the shot at 200th of a second. Now, like I said, this dial at the back controls my shutter, and I've got one in the front of the camera as well here. And when I turn this, it allows me to change my aperture. Now the golden rule is shutter speed controls ambient light. Aperture controls flash power. Shutter speed controls your ambient, and your aperture controls your flash power. Now how that works is that, for instance, if I'm shooting with a faster shutter speed, obviously I'm letting in less light. If I make it slower, like I'm doing here, I'm allowing in more light. So you'll notice here, as I'm going slower, I can basically take it to in the middle where the camera says the exposure is perfect. I can also overexpose by, for instance, going to say 1 second. Now I'm 1 full stop overexposed. So this allows me to control my ambient exposure. So with the flash, there are two ways I can set the flash power. And that's by either going to the back of the flash and then changing the flash power. Now currently my flash, if I just look here at the back of the flash, I've got it set at 64th power. So I can obviously make it 1/28th, which will be less power, or I can make it 32nd or 16th, or even like half or full power, which is like a ton of light, which will totally blow little Raphael away. You won't even see it anymore. You'll just see a white screen because that's a ton of light. So I can either control it at the back of the flash, or I can come to my camera and I can change my aperture. Now the reason the aperture controls the flash power is because the aperture is a specific size when you take the shot. So if you're, for instance, shooting 2.8 or something, your aperture is like this. It's very big. If you shoot with an aperture that's like this, obviously you will have less light coming into the camera. So depending on your aperture setting, you will control how much light or flashlight will enter the camera when you take the shot. Now to show you how that works, let's again take the shot 200th of a second at f11. So now, like I said, this image is flash lit. So all the light coming off, or all the light on this picture is coming from the flash. If I turn the camera off and I take this triggering unit off the camera, turn the camera back on, let's shoot the picture again, you'll see the frame is completely black. So now we know this entire image is flash lit. Now if I want to bring some ambient light into the shot, it's very easy. I just drop the shutter speed. So let's do that. Let's shoot it, for instance, at say a 30th of a second. So now if we compare these two images, there's the, okay, that one is the one that I took the triggering unit off. This is the one at 200th of a second. And you'll notice it's very dark there at the top. And here's the one I just shot at the 30th. And you'll notice the flashlight looks exactly the same, but there's more ambient light in the back. Now I can make it even slower. Let's choose, for instance, say 10th of a second. You can even hear the camera going, tsk, tsk. It's not as fast anymore. Now there's even more light in the shot. So let's make it slower. Let's shoot what the camera sees as perfect. You can hear it was a lot slower. You look at the shot now, you're starting to think, okay, so where's the flash in this image? But there actually is a flash, you just don't really see it. So let's look at what the difference is. Let's take this, let's turn the camera off, and let's take off the flash trigger. Let's take the same shot. When you look at it, you'll see that Raphael is a little bit underexposed because the light is coming from behind. So there's not a lot of light on Raphael, except now for the video light that's falling on him. That makes a big difference. If I turn the video light off, he'll be very underexposed. I'm going to turn the camera off again. And then, so I can attach the triggering unit. Always turn off your camera, because remember, it's all live contacts at the top of the camera. Don't take off the units while the camera is still turned on. So if we compare those two, that's the one without a triggering unit. That's the one with the triggering unit. And you'll notice that nice full light on Raphael's face. Now I pretty much prefer this image compared to, say, this one at the beginning, which you can see it's just harsh, full from the front lighting, or from the little bit from the side. So this is something I think is much better. I might actually just shoot it just a tad bit faster, something like this. So if you compare these two, this one and this one, you'll notice there's just a little bit less light in the back and a little bit more flashlight on it. So you can really change the shot dramatically or drastically just by changing the shutter speed. And I'm not changing my flash power because I'm keeping it at f11. That's why I like to work in manual mode and not TTL, because I know now the flash is at 64th power. It will not change, and I'm not changing my aperture, so nothing here will change. So if we now, for instance, go to the point where we overexpose the ambient light, let's look at that. Now we're at the point where we can't really see the flash anymore, and it's now, if you look at the light from the back, it almost just looks like it's just light that's on. You don't really see it anymore. You're starting to overpower the flashlight with the ambient, especially if you start to go to, say, 2 stops overexposed. This will now become really washed out. Now you've got something like that. So it's very important that when you do your exposures, that you look at your line here, because remember, this is your ambient light. This is what's showing you where your ambience will be. So if you want to shoot the ambient light a little bit darker, you just shoot it a little bit darker. So for me, this is very important to look at your line. This line is also, the exposure line is also on the inside of the camera. I don't use the screen when I'm taking pictures. I look at the inside, because all the settings here, the shutter, the aperture, the ISO and everything, I can see on the inside of the camera. So it just makes it a lot easier to shoot it that way. I don't look at the back of the screen. So that is how you control the difference, like for instance between those two. That's how you control your ambient and your flash exposure, by changing your shutter and your aperture. Okay, that's all for this week's episode. Now next week, part 3 of Off-Camera Flash, episode you don't want to miss, I'm going to show you how I create a self-portrait, but I'll be using in the studio, and I'll be using my off-camera flashes. I'll be using a smoke machine, and we're going to use the flashes, the triggers, everything, and I'm going to show you how I build the shot, and then I'm going to show you the final result. So that's next week. You don't want to miss that. So if you've enjoyed this and you've watched a ton of my episodes, then you should feel terrible because you haven't done this yet. Click that subscribe button and get all these awesome episodes as they come out. Then I'll see you again next week. Bye.